2,000 to 3,000 years ago, Earth had several close encounters with the planet Venus. This period in time can simply be called the Venus Event. During this time period, humanity and essentially all life on the entire planet was just decimated, absolutely annihilated. The planet itself would go through a complete restructuring. Whatever the Earth looked like 4, 5, 10,000 years ago, that is now gone. The entire planet now looks different. For those of you who talk about civilization resets, it does not get any more reset than here. In fact, so far as I'm aware, there's only one other period in time to where this level of destruction is rained down on Earth, quite literally, and that would be within the deluge. But the Venus event is destructive in an entire other way. The environment that the Earth is in when the Venus event takes place is completely different than that of the environment when the deluge happens. These two catastrophic events are absolutely separate. Now, the Venus event itself brings with it all kinds of very unique properties. And of course, the vast majority of those properties are destructive. You have everything from mountains being built up overnight, continents sinking, mountains of water being pulled across landscapes. I mean, it's crazy. It's literally insane. And shockingly enough, it's all backed up by real, testable science. This is not a fantasy. While the destruction of the Venus event is absolutely legendary, and it is legendary because all of our ancestors recorded this destructive event. Everybody did. Like, if you go back in time to a very particular point, you will find mountains being risen overnight. You will find mountains of water. You will find continents sinking, and you will find mass death. You will find rains of fire, and you will find rains of what they describe as blood. All of this exists in the histories, and all of it can be explained scientifically. That's the beauty of science when you actually pay attention to it and you apply it to real history. Suddenly, all of the mythologies can be explained by real phenomena, and then we can stop, making it sound like our ancestors had no idea what was going on because they were describing what they went through. Okay, all right. What I want to talk about today is the fallout of the Venus event and the scientific evidence of that fallout. But more specifically, I want to talk about how the Earth recovered. Because while the mythologies cover the vast range of catastrophic destruction that swept across the planet, it also talks about another event that Venus will usher in that will ensure the survival of the survivors. The survival of the survivor. Oh my God, okay. You know what I mean, right? The people who survive. Okay, so let's put it like this. If the Venus event is real, and I'm not going to go into the details, there's like a million shows on that all over the place. If that level of destruction is real, then every single skeptic who does not want to believe what our ancestors record can very easily ask the question, well, how the hell did everybody pull out of this? And that is a very valid question because, like I said, the destruction of the planet is insane. Not only do we lose continents, right? Not only do we now have mountains where there was no such thing as a mountain, we also have a situation to where the entire planet essentially suffers one hell of a firestorm, right? It's not just earthquakes. It's not just flooding. It is massive fires as well. Basically, if you can imagine the catastrophe, it essentially happens during the Venus event, right? Huge hurricanes, firestorms, earthquakes, tsunamis, mountains of water. Anything, doesn't matter. You have huge canyons opening up, fissures breaking, everything, doesn't matter. It's absolute insanity. And the mythologies record this. The mythologies very specifically state how absolute the destruction was, And when the survivors come out of their holes or wherever the hell they got lucky in hiding, they find a planet that is absolutely devastated. And they very specifically state that they were pretty sure that they were dead and done because there was no more vegetation. There was no way anything was growing anymore. Right? Food was scant. And in fact, one of the main ways that the survivors survive at the very beginning, right as Venus starts to leave, is they're basically scavenging dead animals, which are everywhere. Right? They're going around, they're finding dead woolly mammoths or any of the megafauna that is just kind of strewn about that's been shredded due to the various properties of the cataclysm. And they're just scavenging whatever they can. But eventually, very quickly, the meat starts to rot. The vegetation is starting to rot. The planet is done. And these stories are all very clear that the survivors believe that they are finished. That there is no hope for survival. And scientifically, that would be the case. The level of destruction that the Venus event brings to Earth really is total. It's mind-boggling. So scientifically, you have to ask the question, well, how the hell did everybody survive? Right? How do you pull yourself out of this? And don't forget, it's not just the humans that need to pull themselves out. Plants and animals need to recover as well. Now, plants can kind of grab a foothold a little better than animals can because their seeds go everywhere and they can just kind of start growing where they can. So returning plant life is not too huge of a deal. However, we have to remember that during this period in time, one of the reasons why plants are having a hard time surviving is because the planet is shrouded in darkness. It is shrouded in smoke. It is shrouded in Venus's comet tail still. Sunlight no longer penetrates Earth's atmosphere, at least in a way that is, beneficial to plant life. So plants die off as well. Or at the very least, they struggle incredibly. And our ancestors record this very fact. Everybody is screwed basically after this event. At least that's the way it seems. Now, what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about a layer in geology that covers chunks of the planet. We don't know everywhere that it covers yet. That science is ongoing. But I want to talk about a very specific geological layer, and I would like to propose a possible answer that explains that layer. And that geological layer is known as the black mat. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this geological layer, let me bring you up to speed really fast. Let me go over some of the details, some of the findings that have been made, and after we go over all of the scientific and historical evidence, I will propose another conclusion about what the black mat may actually be. But before we get to that conclusion, you really do need to get an understanding of what the black mat is, where it's found, the depths, stuff like that, locations, and the historical references of this layer. And after we go over all of that stuff, I will give you my conclusion, and then you can make fun of me in the comments and you can yell at me and stuff like that. But anyways, I thought this was interesting. I don't know. I feel there might be something here, so I wanted to share this with everybody. All right, let's do this. Okay. The black mat layer is essentially a very distinct, dark-colored sedimentary layer found at all kinds of archaeological and geological sites across North America. Now, the black mat layer, I believe, can also be found at other sites as well around the world, but it gets a little difficult into identifying this sometimes, and we predominantly right now have found it in North America. And I'll explain why that's the case in a little bit as well. Okay, so anyway. Basically, this layer is a thin, dark, organic-rich layer that is composed of all kinds of fine sediments. Stuff like clay, silt, and you will also find a ton of carbon content in it as well. It typically will appear above what the mainstream calls the Clovis culture archaeological layers, and below post-Clovis strata. So this makes it kind of a chronological marker for what the mainstream would call the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. Now, for those of you who are aware of these dating methodologies for the mainstream, this date falls around the 12,000 to 13,000 ago year mark in the mainstream. So if you're thinking Younger Dryas, yes, this would technically coincide with the mainstream and alternative mainstream's version of what may have happened in the past, right? This would be a Younger Dryas layer. Now, the black mat is found all over the place in North America. We find it in areas, especially places like Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, South Carolina. We found charcoal-rich and carbon-rich sites in areas like California, South Dakota, Pennsylvania, all the way down to Mexico, and some in Canada, but Canada has a more limited amount of the carbon-rich sites. So that's kind of important to remember that even though the black mat layer is essentially a uniform, well-known layer, it's not uniform across the planet. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that as well. So basically, this layer is a very dark, thin band that we find in stratigraphy. Now, the significance of this layer really is related to where we find it and what it's composed of and what it overlays. Now, on the mainstream side of things, their explanation gets weird because, well, it's funny. The mainstream is put into a very awkward position when it comes to looking at this layer. And here's why. So like I said earlier, the Clovis people, right, whoever the hell they were, there was apparently this Clovis people running around, and then all of a sudden their entire civilization, whatever it was, stops. And then this black mat layer appears on top of them. Not only does the Clovis people's existence stop, but also all of the megafauna and flora as well. Something happens immediately and instantly that wipes out all of these people in North America, and it wipes out all of the plant and animal life. And suddenly, for some weird reason, a very dense, rich, organic layer appears right on top of everything. This is a real serious problem for geologists. And of course, the geologists have run to the Ice Age theory to try and figure out and use that as an excuse to explain what they're seeing. Now, when you start to really get into the black mat layer and you start to look at the mainstream's interpretation of it, it gets absolutely hilarious because they are grasping at whatever straw they can to explain why they see what they see all over North America. Because it doesn't make sense geologically, at least in the sense of mainstream interpretations. Basically, a mainstream geologist has no choice but to look at this situation and admit that things have to change. Like their entire methodology of studying this stuff has to change. It really does upend the concept that all of these layers take millions and billions of years to form. Because the reality is, it's quite obvious that none of this took millions and billions of years. Whatever happened, it happened instantly. And I don't even mean instantly relative to geological times. No, I mean instantly like overnight. That is what this layer tells us. And this is why you've either never heard of it, because mainstream geologists don't like to talk about it, or if you have heard about it, you've probably heard about it relative to the Younger Dryas episode. And of course, the Younger Dryas is contingent upon the Ice Age existing. So if the Ice Age never existed, then that means the Younger Dryas never existed, which means that you can't use either of those two explanations to explain the layer of the black mat because it's ridiculous anyways and you don't. The implications of the black mat layer essentially proves that some major catastrophe happened in very recent times, in human times, that completely changed the entire face of the planet. And it happened overnight. Now, for an alternative person, this really isn't too big of a deal. Right? At least the alternative mainstream is open to catastrophes to some degree or another. But as we're going to find as we ramble through this show, the alternative mainstream is still stuck to mainstream dogma, and until they shake that out, they are never going to ever find the truth. So what I mean by that is that the alternative mainstream holds on to the concept of the Younger Dryas, in which, the Younger Dryas requires the Ice Age. If the Ice Age never existed, which it didn't, that means the Younger Dryas doesn't need to exist as an explanation for why we find the evidence that we find, geologically and biologically in North America. So, things get a little weird for mainstream alternative people. And of course, there's mainstream alternative people out there right now who are making a very good living pushing this stuff. And it all sounds very scientific from their perspective, and it only works so long as you never question any of it. So we're going to question some of it. The black mat layer, interestingly enough, is really one of those solid pieces of scientific evidence that proves that something else entirely different happened on this planet. We don't need the Ice Age, we don't need the Younger Dryas or anything like that. Okay. Let me get back into the black mat layer so that we understand in depth what it is and what's been found there. Right? Because Younger Dryas people, it's you just cause my silent rage to grow every time I see some stupid video about somebody trying to tell me that there was this magical comet 12,000 years ago that hit, some kind of a magical ice sheet that causes all. The depth of the black mat layer can vary widely depending on which site you're looking at. It'll vary depending on what the local sedimentation rates are. There's all kinds of variables. However, there's a general range, and the range that the black mat is found in is not very deep. Right? So that's clue number one, that it's recent. So we generally find the common range of where the black mat is buried about 1 foot to 6 to 7 feet below the modern ground's surface. Over in the southwestern area of the United States, the black mat is generally found between 2 and 4 feet deep. In extreme cases, you can find the black mat in as shallow of a stratigraphical area as only a couple of inches, or only a few inches, and then one of the deeper areas that you'll find it in is around 10 feet or so, okay? And the 10-foot areas are generally in heavy alluviated areas, or near what the mainstream would consider an ancient lake bed. Water, right? Something to do with water. That's the clue. So, for example, like over there in Murray Springs, Arizona, you can find the black mat around 16 to 20 inches deep, and that would be above Clovis artifacts and mammoth remains. And the Clovis artifact situation and the mammoth remains, and basically the remains of any kind of megafauna, it's going to be a uniform discovery everywhere. The black mat is always right on top of these things. Now that's very important to remember. Right, so another example would be over there in Blackwater Draw, New Mexico. Over there in New Mexico, it's like 3 to 4 feet deep. Again, right on top of Clovis layers. Over there in Texas, around 3 feet or so. South Carolina will be around 4 to 6 feet deep. And in Mexico, it can be more than 6 feet deep sometimes. So you can kind of get a gauge of where the depths are relative to where the black mat is found. Now, the thickness of the layer is going to be important as well, because if you're a modern geologist, the thicker something is, the older it is, right? It takes billions of years to make these layers, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, that's not the case. But the black mat layer is really not that thick. It's only, generally speaking, 1 to 4 inches thick, with some areas having it around 6 inches. So, it's nothing crazy. It's a relatively small layer. And to be real, in a lot of areas, it is just gone if it was there because, it was right at the surface. It doesn't take much to erode away a few inches of surface layer, and then the black mat could have been easily swept away. So, in the time period we live in now, there's going to be gaps, but, we can't conclusively say one way or another. In some areas that there may have been or may never have been a black mat. But generally speaking, it sounds like the black mat concept really should exist over the entire planet. But I don't have all the information on that because this is still an ongoing study. So I'm just going to basically focus on North America. I might mention, a little bit of Europe or something like that. But let's stick to North America because that's where we have the majority of the data. Earlier in the show, I kind of gave you guys a very general description of what the black mat consists of. But here, let's get a little deeper because it's going to be important to understand the key components that make up this layer. Because once we realize what's in this layer, we can start looking for real scientific explanations. All right, and okay, before I start getting mad, okay. So one of the main things that we find in the black mat layer is peat, algae, and aquatic plants, which, the mainstream likes to blame on, well, it was, swampy, wetland, marsh conditions. And, alright, maybe to a degree they're not necessarily wrong, but only to a degree. Right? But the reality is a mainstream geologist will just throw out the wetland or marsh condition situation as a hand wave. Because if you really start to ask questions on how, half the United States was a wetland and a marsh, only, thousands of years ago, suddenly things get a little weird, okay? So they're not wrong, and that is what has been found, but we need to try to figure out a better explanation as to why we are finding aquatic plants, peat, and algae. We also find a ton of charcoal and soot in this layer. Now, this is extremely important to remember, and it was a discovery that mainstream geology also has a hard time with. Because the amount of charcoal and soot that you find contained in the black mat layer, it really does point towards a worldwide fire on a grand scale. I mean, obviously, right, if the entire world's on fire, that would be pretty grand. But you get my point, right? I mean, something amazing must have happened to the Earth, 12 to 13,000 years ago, if you believe in mainstream chronology. Now, for a geologist, that's tough, because geologists love their millions and billions of years. When you start suggesting that layers were created only thousands of years ago, a geologist's butt puckers up pretty good. Because they rely on the process of millions and billions of years to give them layers. But here, we have entire layers being created essentially overnight. The only saving grace that a geologist has that they can hide behind is that at least it happened maybe 12 to 13,000 years ago. Right, remember, every time, this is the trick that historians and scientists use to wiggle out having to provide any kind of real scientific proof for what they claim. They always throw it back in history to a point to where there's no real way you can prove it. You can say it, but demanding proof of it becomes, semi-unrealistic or completely unrealistic. And that's what they do all the time, right? They constantly do that. That's one of the reasons why history and science is so unbelievably messed up. It's because of the cowardice of these people. Okay. Another thing they found contained in the black mat layer was fulvic and humic acids. Now, these acids are generated when vegetation decays. Also, a very important part to remember. Now, it gets crazier. So, when you look at the black mat layer, it's obvious that it is a very carbon-rich layer. Not very thick, 1 to 4 inches, sometimes 6, but very carbon-rich. However, they have also found some other interesting anomalies that is common only in this layer. For example, they find all kinds of weird platinum anomalies. This find is interesting because platinum on Earth is generally rare, as far as we know. It's a very rare metal. However, it is not so rare in meteorites. So, right off the bat, we have a potential cosmic explanation as to where this layer came from. We also find iridium, which is another extraterrestrial metal. We also find iridium. Iridium is also generally considered an extraterrestrial metal. Another thing that they found en masse in this layer was nanodiamonds. Now, nanodiamonds are generally formed under intense heat and pressure. Calm down, Younger Dryas people. All right, I'll get to you in a second. Just calm down. All right. Do you really want me to start the hunt? I mean, do we really need to start hunting the most dangerous game? Younger Dryas and Ice Age believers? No, I don't want to do that right now because I have to finish recording this garbage. After this show, then, okay, all right. Another thing that was discovered was they found these little magnetic and glassy microspherules. And they're microscopic, generally speaking. And interestingly enough, they float on water. So these little glassy microspheres, let's just call them microspheres. They're generally created when high temperatures are reached during some kind of an impact or a potential airburst. Essentially, you just need a lot of heat and an explosion, and you can create and spread these droplets everywhere. So, I get it. That's another point in the direction for an impact. Sounds like it, right? Okay. The last thing they found were silica and carbon spherules. Now, the way you create those is that you need a temperature above 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the reason why I mention this is because the way the mainstream tried to spin aspects of the black mat layer initially was they were open to mass fires, right? They were open to mass forest fires taking place on the planet. And then they wanted to say that these spherules were created during the forest fire. That's not possible. Something else had to generate heat higher than what a forest fire can bring. So you can, it's not that there were not fires. There were definitely fires, obviously. We find the charcoal, we find the ash, right? We find the soot. But the forest fire is not responsible for the creation of the geological evidence that we see. Right? It certainly didn't create the platinum or the iridium, right? Okay. Yeah, I know. Okay. Anyway. Another thing that they ended up finding inside the layer was a bunch of microfossils and, of course, all kinds of organic content. So, for example, they found diatoms and algae, and I talked about the algae, I think, originally, which, of course, indicates that water had to have been responsible. They also found all kinds of evidence of spores from aquatic plants. Once again, it certainly sounds like water had something to do with this. And then, of course, they found all kinds of fungal spores associated with dung, interestingly enough. And what they found with this, and why this is interesting, why dung fungal spores are interesting, is because they find an immediate decline in these spores once the megafauna die off. Now, this might sound obvious at first, but what it really is that it's more scientific evidence that points to an instant extinction event. Not over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. No, literally overnight. They used to exist. That would be that stupid Clovis layer. And then they stopped existing. That is the black mat layer. Right? And that's what the evidence shows. Now, you're probably wondering, what about the megafauna? Like, what about mastodons, mammoths, giant sloths, horses, camels, saber-toothed cats, blah, blah, blah? What about all of these animals? Shouldn't we find these animals in the black mat layer as well? And interestingly enough, we do not. We do not find the bodies of these animals embedded in the layer. We find all of these animals always directly below it. I mean directly below it. There's no gap. They are literally right there. In fact, it gets crazier. Check this out. Sometimes what will be discovered is you will find maybe just the very top of these megafauna bones sticking into the black mat layer. Just the top. So for example, to illustrate, imagine a woolly mammoth skull, right? It's a huge skull. You know, it's tilted in this in the Clovis period sedimentary stuff. And then right above it is the black mat. And let's say just like 3 or 4 inches of the skull might protrude above the Clovis layer into the black mat layer. Now, when you look at something like this, what it really does show is that when the mammoth was killed, it was killed during whatever created that Clovis layer, right? That's where it's trapped. There is a distinct separation between the Clovis layer and the black mat layer. However, you have a little bit of protrusion here and there, and you can go find all kinds of these bones. Not all kinds. I mean, they're not rare, but they're not common. But you can find megafauna bones to where you will find half of the bone is like really black, and the other half is essentially, you know, a light white or gray or whatever. And that indicates that that bone protruded into the black mat layer. A lot of people will look at this and think, well, you know, maybe the earth shifted a little bit over time and then the bones were siphoned upwards or some crap like that and eventually made contact. But that does not appear to be the case. Because of the staining on the bones and because there is no evidence of disruption of the stratigraphy, what this shows us is that the animal died in the Clovis layer and was buried apparently immediately, and then the black mat was laid right on top of it. Now, some of these animals may not have been buried totally. Some of them might have had a little bit of their skull sticking above whatever buried them, right? They might have had a tusk protruding out of the mud and dirt that they were buried in. And then the black mat would then cover that. What that shows us is that you have 2 distinct geological layers which are laid on top of each other, one after another, almost instantaneously. That's just basic science. There's no way around that conclusion. And we find this all over the place. All right, so that's going to be important to remember. All right, let's keep going on more details. There's so much. It's important. I know I'm just blabbling about this stuff, but it's really important to understand what the black mat is made out of, what the discoveries truly are, because, you know, right now you have Younger Dryas people using this evidence willy-nilly and just saying, oh, it's an impact. And the reason why Younger Dryas people have to say that is because they are operating with the exact same scientific tools that the mainstream is operating with. All they have is impacts. That's all they have. They don't have anything else because they have been taught nothing else. They have no idea about plasma. They have no idea about electricity, nothing. They don't know anything about that. They have to claim that it is an impact. And what I'm going to show you at the end of all of this is that that is not the case. That something else happened, and then something amazing happened after that. I know, we'll get there. I know, I'm just building up. Hey, at least I don't put ads on this garbage. I don't have enough subscribers, I don't think, to do that anyway. I never do that. Hey, you know, and also, I never ask you guys to do that dumb crap like and subscribe. Who the hell doesn't know how to do that? Who the hell needs to be told how to do that? You just want to grab their neck, right? Just start choking them, just start slapping the crap out of them. What about a human presence? Do we find any kind of presence of human society or humans at all in the black mat layer? And the answer is simple. No, we don't. We do not find the presence of humans during the black mat creation. What this tells us is that whatever slaughtered and destroyed that Clovis layer, whatever created that Clovis layer immediately, I mean, that really was the end for anybody who was alive during that period of time. That's what the science shows. There's no way around it. Right? This catastrophe wiped out anybody who was alive, basically, in North America. The black mat layer is essentially devoid of human artifacts. Also very important to remember. So what happened? What's going on? What could have potentially created this layer? Now, the mainstream is very boring and very hand-wavy, and their explanation is a joke. They just believe that as the glaciers melted, as these magical 2 to 3 mile high glaciers on the North American continent start to melt, what happens is that all of their water will rush from north to south and eventually start to create, things like inland seas, marshy environments, etc., etc. And on the surface, for a mainstreamer, that's enough. They're like, yep, that sounds about right. I don't really have to prove it, and I can't prove it because it's, 13,000 years ago, so we're gonna do that. Now give me my college education degree, and then I can say whatever I want because I have a piece of paper that I spent 100 grand on that says that I know everything, and blah, blah, blah. And that's what they do. So the mainstream, will just discard them because their science is not there. It's just not there. If you go a little further in the mainstream, here, I'll give a little bit of credit. There are those scientists which are now starting to at least start to gravitate towards the concept of the Younger Dryas impact. Now, they do that because that's all they have, right? Mainstream only has mainstream science, and mainstream science is so far behind real science, it's hilarious. So they only have the concept of an impact. Because mainstream still has to explain how the ice melted quick. There's no way around that, right? If you believe in an ice age, you must also believe that the ice melts very fast. And I mean very fast. And this is where it gets a little weird with mainstream geologists because they got to figure out a way to warm that ice up quick. So they'll use all kinds of excuses like, well, okay, maybe there was an impact and then that impact jump-started the climate of the planet got really hot, and they jump through all of these hoops to try to explain stuff, and the hoops they jump through sound good initially, they really do. But when you start to look into their excuses, it really falls apart quickly. But that's a good segue into the general Younger Dryas concept. Because the Younger Dryas, that's the belief that, some kind of a comet impact hit the Earth during the Ice Age, hit Earth, North America. It would have impacted North America. It hit the ice sheet. It, hyper melted a huge portion of the ice sheet. And then that was the trigger that started everything from there. Now, alternative Younger Dryas people are more willing to admit that things happened really quick, which is, a good start. But there's all kinds of problems with the Younger Dryas portion. Problems like, prove to me that there was an impact on an ice sheet. They've got nothing. They try to show us that Hudson Bay might be the impact zone, or they try to show us that the Great Lakes were the impact zone. And then the smart Younger Dryas people will try to say, oh, but look at all the Carolina Bays, right? Those are perfect, outward spread impacts from the Great Lakes, right? That just proves it. It's like, oh, really? Those are impacts. Now, of course, if you believe in that theory, then you also believe that the impact left behind no physical evidence, because there is no physical evidence in the Carolina Bays for any kind of an impact whatsoever. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist. The only thing that they're looking at correctly is the orientation of the Carolina Bays facing the Great Lake area. That's all they're doing correctly. But, once again, all they have is impacts. That's it. That's all they've got. There's nothing else they can use to explain any of this. Anyway, so the Younger Dryas will look at something like the black mat, and they will look at the evidence that I have just talked about, things like, say, the platinum and the iridium, the nanodiamonds, things like that, and they'll say, well, you can only create those from an impact, right? The black mat is proof of an impact. You can see it right there. How can you possibly not say it's an impact? And the only thing I will respond to that for this show anyways, is I will just say, are you sure that that is the only method that can create those conditions? Because don't forget, there is no meteoric material in any of these supposed craters. And the next coping mechanism is, well, there was these giant ice comets and they all melted, so that's why there's no material. It's like, all right, what do you do with that, man? It's just constant excuse after excuse to try and not provide any evidence that supports the claim. I mean, it's the same thing that the mainstream does. Okay, anyway, the Younger Dryas is contingent upon an impact, because they will use that impact idea to also explain, the huge firestorms that raged across the planet. So apparently a giant block of ice started tons of fire. Yeah, I know. And then, and all the other problems on the planet. Okay, I'll get off of the Younger Dryas. All right, I'll stop. I will stop. I love all of you. It's fine. I don't hate anybody. I just think that, okay, all right. So, when we look at another explanation for the black mat, the Younger Dryas, that boils down to some kind of a cosmic impact. Ultimately, the Ice Age and the Younger Dryas explanation for the black mat falls short, because they both rely on the exact same biological and geological process. Right? They need to have these vast swamps which magically turn into carbon in only a few thousand years. That's what they need. And it doesn't work. And you also still have to explain how you bury, an entire continent to create that Clovis layer quickly. Because don't forget, that Clovis layer does not show evidence of slow deposition. That Clovis layer is proof of immediate deposition. Remember, they find woolly mammoths literally in mid-step. They found a whole herd one time in mid-stride, buried. And interestingly enough, they are all looking behind themselves, as if they were staring at the destruction that was coming towards them while they were running from it. Right? Whatever buried the Clovis culture, whatever buried the mammoths, whatever buried the megafauna, it buried it immediately. These animals did not have time to decay. There was no predation. This layer happened immediately. Now that's a separate show in and of itself, and that's the major cataclysm that Venus will bring in. And of course, all that deposition will come from the mountain of water, which will roll across North America as it's being dragged by an electrical connection with Venus. Remember, you need a quick way, a powerful way to get a ton of material to bury animals. And it has to be done with water. That's how you do it. It's that simple. And it's based on science and eyewitness testimony from our ancestors. All right, so the Clovis layer is created during the destructive part of Venus. Okay, that's as far as I can tell, that's the best answer right now. That covers all the bases, and you can use science to prove it. Now, we want to focus on the black mat. The black mat is layered right on top of that destructive layer. So the question becomes, what the hell is that then? What is going on here? How do you create a 1 to 4 inch thick layer of nothing but carbon and organic wet material? How do you get that? Where does that come from? Just imagine this huge layer of destruction has befallen the entire planet. But North America has now been covered in dozens and in some cases hundreds of feet of just mud, dirt, and rock right overnight because of this mound of water. And then the mound of water subsides once Venus goes away. Once that connection is lost, the mountain of water will crash back down to Earth, and it will leave the marshy environment that the mainstream sees evidence for. Because not all of the water is just going to sit on the continent, it's going to drain back into the ocean. Especially now that there's new oceans to drain back into. But now you have this whole wetland area. But is that wetland area what really creates the black mat layer? Is the remnants of that what creates it? I would say only partially, and it would be a very small part indeed. The reason why I say this is this. Once the survivors come out of their holes and they look around and they find the earth charred, they find huge mountains where there were valleys, or oceans where there was land. They also find absolute desolation. There is nothing to eat. The sky is dark. Basically, at this point in time, everybody's assuming that this is the end. This is what they were afraid of, right? This is what those supposed cycles that we find in history talked about. They knew that this was a possibility, and finally it happened, because it had happened on smaller scales before as Venus had approached every year. This just happened to be the worst one, and this was the most destructive. So how do they survive? What are they going to do? Well, something miraculous happens that essentially jump starts planet Earth. And it is recorded all over the planet. For some weird reason, for some scientific reason, this is a scientific process. This is not, metaphysical God garbage. But there is some process that suddenly causes milk and honey to rain down on planet Earth. Now, this is where it gets interesting. If we look at the ancient histories of people all over the planet, we find many similarities or exactitudes, but here's something we find relative to the Venus event. We find the planet Venus being revered as a quote-unquote god for the mainstream, and Venus is known as the destroyer. And that is exactly what Venus will eventually herald in. It will herald in this ultimate destruction of Earth, this ultimate reshaping of the planet. She does it. She does it just as they knew she would. But shortly after this, for some weird reason, Venus will suddenly become the giver of life. She will no longer be worshipped as the god of destruction. She will now be worshipped as somebody who brings life to planet Earth. What the hell is going on? How do we go from Venus being the destructor of everything to suddenly bringing nothing but life and savior to the planet? What happened? Cultures all over the world explain exactly what happened. After this devastation, the survivors are wandering around. You'll have some dead bodies of woolly mammoths and stuff like that, just barely sticking their dead bodies above the new Clovis layer that they're now walking on, right? Right, they're sloshing through the newly created swamplands from the leftover ocean water as it drains back into the new oceans. Suddenly, raining down from the sky comes what many cultures will call manna. Other cultures will call it milk and honey. Other cultures will call it syrup. But there is this weird honey-smelling substance that will rain down on planet Earth for centuries to come that can be used to sustain life. Everybody has this story. This is not just relative to North America. But because we're only talking about North America, let me tell you some stories from the North American Indians which corroborate this story. For those of you who are wondering, is this the same thing as the Bible? Yes, the Bible records the exact same thing. This has nothing to do with a God, nothing to do with Moses or Jesus or whatever, nothing. This is simply a recorded historical event that everybody has after the destruction. Here are some excerpts from the North American Indians. The Ojibwe, the Cree, the Abenaki, they all talk about the sweet rain of maple syrup that will come down to the earth after one of the great floods. The Tlingit and the Haida will talk about a grease rain of fat from the sky that will appear after the floods. Fat and sweetness from the sky is what the Inuit and the Arctic will talk about. The white milk rain of the Sky Woman will be talked about by the Iroquois and the Huron. The Hopi and the Zuni will talk about the honey sky. of the twin gods that will eventually rain down sustenance onto the planet. And it will be like liquid honey. This is recorded all over the world, but what I'm giving you here specifically is North American Indian history talking about milk and honey, manna raining down from the sky. This is what will save all the survivors and the plants and animals on Earth and will allow Earth to recover. When all was lost, all of a sudden this weird substance rains down onto Earth like dew, and you can eat it. You can bake it into bread. It is useful to all life on this planet. Essentially, it sounds like there was some kind of a chemical process going on up in space while Venus was done with its flyby, some kind of an electrical chemical process. Like, this is science, we don't need God. But something happened to create what is essentially carbohydrates that would rain down on Earth for several centuries. And it would rain down with tons of it. Remember, people could store it, but they didn't need to because they said every morning there was just tons of it everywhere. You didn't need to. Everywhere you went, it was just there. What I contend is that the black mat layer is the milk and honey. It is the remnants of the manna that fell across this planet. That is what I believe that the black mat layer represents. Because it is pure carbon rich. It is pure rich in what we would call simple life. Is it possible that milk and honey would eventually decay into what we now know as the black mat layer? In my opinion, I think that might be what it is. I don't know. Because how else do you explain it, right? It lines up with the histories and it lines up with the science. Now, if you're wondering why does it have like iridium and platinum in it and stuff like that, well, it's simple. We just got done dealing with the comet tail of Venus. We also just got done dealing with the electrical zaps from Venus. There was a lot of plasmatic activity going on between those two bodies. To say that we would not have seen the creation of these materials is ridiculous. We would have. And to top it all off, Earth was also being bombarded with meteors as well. So it's not that the cosmic impact theory is necessarily wrong. It's just not, it's not just one event, right? Fire rains down from the sky. Everybody talks about the stars raining down. There was more than one meteor coming down towards Earth. The entire planet was just absolutely rained down upon by meteor showers. The entire planet. Everywhere. That dust would eventually settle into the manna layer that was being created. Right? That dust would be flying around for a while. And eventually it would settle itself into the black mat layer. That black mat layer would appear right on top of the Clovis layer. This is why you would find a situation to where you don't find human life in the layer, because everybody's basically gone. There is no civilization. All the animals are essentially dead. Right? So this layer will go undisturbed essentially, and it will just be blanketed down in North America. North America seems to have been hit the hardest out of the entire planet. I mean, you know, minus the continents that sank, okay? Minus those guys. Those guys had it worse, I'll give them that. But North America was probably the number one continent that got absolutely destroyed. Because this continent is just cleansed during this period of time. That's what the evidence shows. And it's not just of human occupation, it's of all life. So when the manna falls on North America, there's really nothing there to exploit it. So it just slowly creates a layer. And over time, it will solidify into that 1 to 4 inch layer that we find. I believe that the black mat layer is the remnants of the manna that fell on Earth after the Venus event. And if we look at real chronology, this would have only happened 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. not 12 or 13. A completely different picture is painted of our planet, but it's one that's backed up by history and science. Everything I just said is the only reason why I am coming to this conclusion is because the history and the science point me in that direction. Now, I'm not saying 100% that's true. Okay, I just wanted to throw this out to everybody because I thought it was fascinating. Because nobody really has a good explanation at all. You know, Ice Agers and Younger Dryas people don't have anything. But everybody's gravitating towards that. You know, but it's like, what happens if we just throw aside all the garbage and we only follow history and science? If we only follow history and science, right now, in my opinion, the black mat layer is the remnants of the manna that showered this earth for several centuries after the destruction of the Venus event.